talk about gravitational microlensing in the era of all-sky surveys. So first, what is gravitational lensing? Gravitational lensing is when you have a massive object that bends light around it. So for example, if we're here on Earth, you have some galaxy in a cluster, it'll bend the light from some distant object, say some other galaxy. Then we'll see, as if the light had gone straight, distorted images of that distant object. So if we rotate this image this way, so Earth's over there, here's an example of some galaxy, this red galaxy in the middle, and a blue galaxy behind it that's being lensed by that foreground galaxy. And you can see they're almost perfectly aligned, and so that's why you get nearly a perfect circle of that distant galaxy. In the case of microlensing, instead of looking at galaxies, which are collections of stars and black holes and other objects, instead we look at individual stars and black holes. And so here, in black we have a lens. We're going to pretend that it's not moving. We'll be in the frame of the lens. And in red we'll have the star moving by. And in blue you can see distorted images of that distant object that correspond with the distorted images we see before. And so you'll have these events that happen over the course of from a few hours to a few days to potentially up to years long. In microlensing, we generally can't actually resolve those distorted images. What I mean by resolve is, say, I were holding two flashlights. Here you'd be able to tell that I was holding two flashlights, but on the other side of a football field, you would just see one kind of distorted blob that was brighter than any individual flashlight. The same thing happens here. We can't actually resolve those distorted images. Instead, we just see a brightening and a dimming of the distant star. This method was used to find the first isolated stellar mass black hole. In this movie that I'll play, you'll see a representation of what's called the light curve. This is the brightness over time. And you'll see a set of images. And you'll see the star get brighter and fainter again as the black hole passes in front of it. You can see here it gets brighter and then fainter again. And this is the only known way to probe isolated stellar mass black holes. And that's really exciting because we think that most black holes are in isolated systems, understanding black holes can help us to push the boundary of our knowledge of physics. Since they're very extreme objects, they're the depth point of a lot of stars, stuff like this. And this was found in 2022, and it's about 6 times the mass of our sun. There's a few measurable quantities that are relevant in microlensing. One is called the Einstein crossing time, or TE, which you can think of as the duration of the mass of the lens. The duration of the microlensing event. This is dependent on the mass of the lens, but also the relative proper motions of the lens and source, and also the relative distances in the lens and source. So there can be degeneracies there, where, say, a slow moving object and a massive object can both produce a long duration microlensing event. There's also the microlensing parallax, or pi-e. As the Earth goes around the sun, you'll be viewing the microlensing event from different angles. This can lead to bumps and asymmetries in the light curve. So for example, down here, in red, you have the lowest microlensing parallax, where you have a very smooth, symmetric light curve, and in purple you have the most, where you can see the bumps and asymmetries. And so it can be really useful to plot these. So here we have the microlensing parallax, so that asymmetry is a function of the Einstein crossing time, that duration. And these are for a set of simulated lenses. And so you can actually start to identify black holes in this space. So in red are simulated black hole lenses, and they separate out from the rest of the stars and other objects in this space. But as I mentioned before, there's a lot of degeneracy, so there's a lot of mixing between all these populations, and there's uncertainty in some of these measurements that can make it hard to distinguish. So it doesn't only find black holes. Microlensing actually can reveal a lot of different properties. For example, it can help us to look at the mass functions and binary fractions of stars. Stars that are too faint to be probed by other means, but it still have a gravitational signal, or binary stars that are too far to be probed by other means, and therefore too faint. It can also tell us things about the galactic velocity and spatial distributions, again with a wider variety of objects that might be possible from other means, and you don't need to precisely know the positions to be able to take a set of microlensing events and start to model some of these systematics. So for example here, again this is the microlensing parallax, that shape is a function of the Einstein crossing time, and so we talked earlier about how mass moves you down in this direction. But differences in relative proper motion, your speed of your lenses and sources, if you're faster, you move that way, and the relative parallax, which tells you about the distances between your lens and source, moves you up this way. And then, as I mentioned earlier, you can find dark objects like black holes, planets, and also potentially free-floating planets, planets without a host star. And in order to do this kind of science, we need a large photometric survey to find these quantities through microlensing. So what is a photometric survey? That's basically when you have a telescope that can measure the brightnesses of many different stars and objects in time. You'll take lots of different pictures of the sky and ideally be able to scan the sky quickly so that you can cover a large area to try and characterize these events. And so you have microlensing, but you have other things like exploding stars and supernova and variable stars, stuff like this. So first I'm going to be talking about the Zwicky Transient Facility. So this is a survey that's carried out by the 48-inch telescope at Palomar Observatory in Southern California. And so I'll be talking about using the 5 years of data. And here's a footprint of generally how it covers in the sky. This is a little bit confusing. Basically, the more yellow it is, the more observations that part of the sky has, and the bluer is the least part. And you can see that it's in the northern hemisphere, so above a certain latitude you don't have any observations. And they have a certain strategy. They didn't cover all of the sky equally. They focused on certain areas that they were more interested in, though with a fair amount of coverage of the galaxy, which corresponds to this kind of circular shape. So in the first 3 years of ZTF data, we found 51 microlensing events, 10 of which were outside of the galactic plane. And so let's break down what these plots mean. So basically, down here is your number of objects with at least 20 observations. That's the bare minimum for trying to say something about, does the light curve look like a microlensing event? You can see you're more concentrated over here, where there there's more objects in the galaxy, which corresponds with this line here. And up here, we have what's called the level 5 candidates. Basically, we did this thing where we cut down each candidate based on how well it was fit to a microlensing model, how good the data looked, stuff like this. And so at this level, this was all done by automated cuts. And you can see these blue dots, these are the candidates. These green circles correspond with simulations we did of the galaxy to compare our results. Next, we actually had to do a bi-eye component. This won't be sustainable for future surveys that I'll talk about more in a bit. And so we're going to learn from this to try and improve our pipeline. Nevertheless, here are the observations in red that we found, and you can see that most of them correspond with the galaxy, but there are a fair number outside. So we didn't find any likely black hole candidates in the first 3 years of data. Again, this is your light curve shape or microlensing parallax is a function of your event duration. Down here are simulated black hole lenses, in blue are simulated stellar lenses, and in red you can see the actual events we found. And that's not because we don't think there's any black holes in this data, but rather that in the first 3 years of data, we didn't leave enough baseline for you to probe these events. You can see that all of the black holes are approximately over 100 days in duration. Okay, you might think that 100 days, that's less than 3 years, but a large part of microlensing is knowing that your baseline is flat outside of the microlensing event, and so we required a certain amount baseline. However, there were 802 ongoing candidates with at least 150 days of your Einstein crossing time or your event duration. And so if these are cut down at a similar rate as the other candidates, that should lead a few black hole candidates. So next, let's talk about Rubin Observatory. So Vera C Rubin Observatory is a telescope that was built in Chile and is just turned on. The alerts, so these are things where they're seeing a star vary and they say, this, people should know about this, this is an alert, started last week. And so this can scan the entire southern sky over the course of 3 days. It has a large field of view, a large area that it covers with a single picture. And so I'll just talk a little bit about its survey strategy. So there's a lot of balancing between science that benefits from galactic science, by looking at the galaxy you can learn things, versus science that is outside of the galaxy, like exploding stars, which happen so infrequently that you need to look at other galaxies to see them. And so there's been an evolution of the areas that Rubin will cover. So you can see back in 2018, they were barely going to look at the galaxy at all. This part corresponds with our own Milky Way. And then as they went, they decided to focus, to include the galaxy in the survey footprint, and then refine that as it went. And so for microlensing, we found that covering areas of higher stellar density makes the largest impact for finding microlensing events, and that Rubin should be using its unique capability to look throughout the galaxy to say some things like how the mass function changes throughout the galaxy, how the number of black holes changes throughout the galaxy, things like this. However, there should be also potentially some of this minimal rolling, so a little bit of extra focus towards the galactic bulge, since there's this other telescope, the Nancy Grace Roman telescope, that's going to be great for microlensing, and having the baseline from the ground will lead to great synergy for better characterizing microlensing events. So to actually take the events that we've learned about and to say something about them, say something about what this means for the mass function, what this means for galactic structure, galactic dynamics. We will need to predict and model the population, so including black holes and binary stars, with simulations, and I'll be talking about PopSyCLE. So PopSyCLE is a population synthesis code. Basically what we do is we start out with this other code called Galaxia, which simulates the Milky Way using single stars only. By single, I just mean a star on its system, as opposed to a binary, which would be like a star and a star orbiting each other, or a star and a black hole, or two black holes orbiting each other, which we know is a large fraction of stars that exist. So start with the Milky Way using single stars only. Then we inject in the compact objects and binary companions using the positions and velocities from Galaxia. This would actually be useful beyond microlensing at this stage. You can go and you can learn things about, in general, the binary distributions or mass distributions that a survey might see. But of course, we're interested in microlensing. So we keep going and do a mock microlensing survey, and then we simulate binary lightcurves to understand better the how they're observable. So, we want to know how often black holes and other objects are in binaries, and when they can make a measurable binary signal, or when they masquerade as singles. So up here, you have a typical microlensing event. Goes up, goes down, fairly symmetric. Over here, you have an obvious binary with multiple peaks. Here, you have an ambiguous binary lens. Turns out this is binary, but it doesn't have multiple peaks. There's some asymmetry, but as I mentioned earlier, that could just be from parallax, from the Earth going around the sun. So it's not until you do intensive modeling that you can tell this is actually binary. What we found is that more than half of stellar and compact object microlensing events have at least one binary, either binary lens, binary source, or both. This is way higher than the fraction that's reported. About 10%, between 3 and 11% throughout all the literature of binaries. So the next obvious question is, what fraction of these would actually be detected as binaries? So what we did is that we simulated light curves based on one of these ground-based surveys. And then we fit them with microlensing models as they do. And we can see the vast majority of these are fit well with what's called a point source, point lens light curve. That just means single source, single lens. And you can see 52% of all microlensing events that happened were binary, but were fit well by a single source, single lens. And we actually recovered about 7% where these are binaries that are fit poorly to a point source, point lens model. Most of these other ones are just being incorporated in and generally don't get incorporated when they do the modeling to try and extract things like the mass function, stuff like this. There are also this small fraction of events that are fit poorly by a single source, single lens model. And this is mostly due to the parallax, because we didn't actually model with parallax to mimic exactly what the ground-based survey is doing. So here's some sample light curves. Here's what these look like. So up here, you have typical single source, single lens light curves. Some of them look pretty symmetric. Some of them have some signs of parallax. Down here, we have the multi-peaked binaries. Some have these really wacky structures. Some have a secondary peak, like this. And then over here, we have binaries with one observable peak. Some are a little bit asymmetric, or have a secondary peak that's below our detection threshold. But a lot of them really look identical to single source, single lens. We can also ask, when we observe these binary microlensing events, we might want to learn things about the binaries. For example, what's called the semi-major axis distribution. So that's the distribution of separations between the binaries. That can tell us things about their formation and their evolution. So here we have a PDF of the semi-major axis distributions. Let's focus down here. These are the multi-peak binaries. These are the ones that are more likely to be identified as binary. You can see in blue the pre-microlensing distributions, in orange the post-microlensing lens companions, and in green the post-microlensing source companions. And you can see that there's significant differences between these. So if we were to say something about our measured semi-major axis distributions, then you'd have to take into account the differences in completeness between as a function of the semi-major axis. We also looked at the same thing for the mass ratio distribution. So that's the ratio of, for example, the mass of one divided by the mass of the other component of the binary. And we actually didn't see a significant difference between the pre-microlensing and post-microlensing companions. So in summary, we discovered 51 microlensing events in the first 3 years of the ZTF data. We find that over half of our simulated events with PopSyCLE include a binary lens or source system. So it's critical for microlensing surveys to include binarity, both on the individual event level and across the survey. And with upcoming surveys, we'll need to adapt how we fit and identify microlensing events, both for efficiency and for completeness. Thank you.